The flames had been dead for 3 days, but the smoke still clung to everything: clothes, hair, the very air itself. Thomas Mitchell stood at the edge of what had been Willowbrook's merchant quarter, his boots grinding ash into mud. Behind him, the townspeople whispered like vultures, their voices sharp with accusation and fear. "Devil's work," old Mrs. Henderson hissed. "Mark my words, Thomas Mitchell, you brought this curse upon us all." Thomas didn't turn around. He couldn't. Because deep down, in the part of his soul he tried to keep locked away, he wondered if they were right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Thomas Mitchell saw her, she was standing in the ruins of what had been the Whitmore Apothecary, her bare feet planted firmly in the ash-covered floorboards, as if she belonged there. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, catching the morning light like spun copper, and her dress, simple brown wool that had seen better days, was somehow untouched by the soot that coated everything else in the aftermath of the Great Fire. Thomas had come to survey the damage, same as he did every morning since the flames had torn through downtown Willowbrook 3 weeks prior. As the town's only carpenter with steady hands and a reputation for honest work, folks expected him to have answers about rebuilding. But answers were hard to come by when half the town lay in charred ruins and the other half spent their days pointing fingers at anyone who looked different. "Miss?" he called out, stepping carefully over the collapsed beam that had once supported the apothecary's front door. "You shouldn't be in there. Building's not safe." She turned toward him slowly, and Thomas felt his breath catch. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and deep, with flecks of gold that seemed to shift in the light. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that made him think of old forests and older secrets. "It's safe enough," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "Southern, maybe, or foreign. The bones are still good. The foundation stones weren't touched by the fire." Thomas frowned, glancing around at the blackened walls and collapsed shelving. To his eye, the building was a total loss, dangerous at best, cursed at worst, according to the townsfolk who crossed themselves whenever they passed by. "Ma'am, I've been working wood and stone for 15 years. This place is beyond saving." She smiled then, and it was like watching sunrise break through storm clouds. "Is it? Look again, Thomas Mitchell." He blinked, startled that she knew his name. But as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he began to see what she saw. The main support beams were scorched but solid. The stone foundation was intact, as she'd sighed. The damage, while extensive, followed a pattern as if the fire had been selective, destroying what was weak while preserving what mattered. "How do you—" he started, then stopped. "Who are you?" "Evelyn Ashwood," she said, brushing ash from her hands with practiced ease. "And before you ask, yes, I know what people are saying about me." Thomas had heard the whispers, of course. A strange woman had been seen walking the roads outside town on the night of the Great Fire, carrying a leather satchel and muttering words in a language no God-fearing person should know. Some claimed she'd been dancing naked under the moon while Willowbrook burned. Others swore they'd seen her talking to animals, ravens and cats and other creatures that served darkness. But looking at her now, standing in the morning light with ash on her dress and kindness in her strange eyes, Thomas found those stories hard to believe. She looked tired more than anything else, like someone who'd been walking a long time and still had further to go. "People talk," he said carefully, "especially when they're scared." "And are you scared of me, Thomas Mitchell?" He considered the question honestly. Should I be? Instead of answering, she knelt beside a pile of what had been herb jars, their contents scattered and burned. She began sorting through the debris with delicate fingers, setting aside pieces of glass and ceramic that seemed too damaged to be worth saving. "Mrs. Whitmore knew her plants," Evelyn said conversationally. "Willow bark for headaches, chamomile for sleepless nights, echinacea for the coughs that come with winter. She held up a charred fragment of pottery. This held calendula. Good. For wounds that won't heal. You knew Ruth Whitmore? I know plants, Evelyn corrected. Same as my mother did, and her mother before her. It's useful knowledge, especially in places where doctors are scarce and winters are hard. Thomas watched her work, noting the careful way she handled even the most damaged pieces, as if they still held value he couldn't see. You planning to stay in Willowbrook? Depends, she said, glancing up at him. On whether there's work for someone with my particular skills. What kind of work would that be? Instead of answering directly, she stood and brushed the dirt from her skirts. From her leather satchel, she withdrew a small glass vial, filled with what looked like crushed leaves mixed with something else, seeds, maybe, or tiny dried flowers. Jenny Morrison's baby has been crying for 3 days straight, she said. Colic. From the sound I heard when I passed their house this morning. This will help if she's willing to trust it. Thomas knew the Morrisons. Good people, but struggling since the fire took Daniel's cobbler shop. Their baby had been sick on and off since birth, and Doc Peterson's remedies never seemed to help. Much. You can cure colic? I can ease it, Evelyn said. There's a difference. She held the vial out to him, and Thomas found himself taking it without quite meaning to. The glass was warm against his palm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though they were standing in shadow. Why give this to me? He asked. Why not take it to them yourself? For the first time since he'd met her, Evelyn's confident mask slipped slightly. Because people are more likely to trust medicine that comes from someone they know. Someone they don't whisper about in the streets. And what do I tell them when they ask where it came from? Tell them the truth, she said. That's someone who knows about plants mated for their child. That it's been tested, and it's safe. That love went into the making of it. Thomas turned the vial over in his hands. It looked ordinary enough, ground herbs in clear glass, nothing more exotic than what his grandmother might have mixed in her kitchen. But there was something about the way Evelyn spoke of it, the certainty in her voice, that made him believe it might actually work. What do you want in return? Nothing, she said. Nothing but the chance to prove that not all strangers bring harm. That afternoon, Thomas found himself standing on the Morrisons' front porch, feeling like a fool with Evelyn's vial clutched in his sweaty palm. Through the thin walls, he could hear baby Sarah's endless wailing, a sound that had been echoing through the neighborhood for days, setting everyone's nerves on edge. Jenny Morrison answered the door looking haggard, her hair escaping its pins, and her apron stained with spit up. Behind her, Daniel paced the small front room, bouncing the screaming infant with the desperate rhythm of a parrot at the end of his rope. Thomas, Jenny said, attempting a smile. I'd invite you in, but I brought something, he interrupted, holding out the vial. For the baby, it's for colic. Jenny's eyes fixed on the small bottle with the intensity of someone drowning who'd been thrown a rope. Where did you get it? Doc Peterson said there wasn't anything more he could do. Someone new in town made it, Thomas said, sticking as close to the truth as he could manage. Someone who knows about herbs and healing. Is it safe? Daniel called from inside, still bouncing Sarah, though her cries had quieted slightly as if she sensed a change in the air. The person who made it says it's been tested. Says it's safe for babies. Jenny took the vial with trembling hands, uncorking it to sniff the contents. The mixture smelled like chamomile and fennel, with an undertone of something else Thomas couldn't identify, earthy and green, like forest after rain. How much do I give her? Just a few drops on the tongue, Thomas said, remembering Evelyn's instructions. And it might not work right away, but it should help. They invited him in to wait, more out of politeness than expectation, but Thomas found himself genuinely curious to see what would happen. Daniel held Sarah upright against his shoulder while Jenny carefully measured 3 drops of the mixture onto a clean finger and touched it to the baby's lips. For a moment, nothing changed. Sarah continued her fussing, though perhaps with less intensity than before. Then, gradually the crying began to subside. Her tiny fists unclenched, and her breathing grew deeper and more regular. Within 10 minutes, she was sleeping peacefully. For the first time in days. "My God," Jenny whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's actually quiet." Daniel sank into his chair, Sarah still cradled against his chest, his own eyes wet with relief. "Who did you say made this?" "Someone new," Thomas repeated. "Someone who wanted to help. We need to pay them," Jenny said. "We don't have much since the fire, but they don't want payment," Thomas assured her. "Just ... Maybe tell folks it worked, if they ask." Word spread quickly, as word always did in small towns. By evening, half of Willowbrook knew that baby Sarah Morrison had finally stopped crying. And by the next morning, people were asking questions. Who had made the medicine? Where could they get some? What other remedies might this mysterious healer possess? Thomas found Evelyn exactly where he'd left her the day before, still sorting through the ruins of the apothecary. But now she wasn't alone. The debris had been organized into neat piles, salvageable glass here, usable pottery there, damaged but repairable items in between. "It worked," he said without preamble. "Of course it worked," she replied, not looking up from her sorting. "Fennel and chamomile have been soothing colicky babies for centuries. I just knew the right proportions. People are asking questions. I imagine they are. They want to know who you are, what else you can do." Now she did look up, her storm cloud eyes meeting his directly. "And what did you tell them?" "The truth," Thomas said. "That someone who knows about healing made medicine for a sick child. That it worked. That maybe the people of Willowbrook could use someone with your knowledge." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her hands still among the pottery shards. "Thomas Mitchell," she said eventually, "you're either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," he admitted. "But I saw what you did for that family. If you can help other people the same way." "Help," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Is that what you think this is, isn't it?" She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her dress. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of voices, multiple voices, growing closer. A crowd was gathering in the street outside the ruined apothecary. "We'll see," Evelyn said quietly. "We'll see if they still think it's help when they learn what I really am." Through the empty window frame, Thomas could see them coming, a dozen townspeople at least, led by Mayor Ashford and Reverend Clark. Their faces were set with the particular determination of people who'd worked themselves up to righteous action, and in that moment, as the morning light caught the gold flecks in Evelyn's eyes, and the crowd's footsteps echoed off the cobblestones, Thomas Mitchell realized that his quiet life in Willowbrook was about to become very complicated indeed. The first stones hadn't been thrown yet, but he could feel them coming. The first accusations hadn't been made, but he could hear them building and the voices drawing closer. And beside him stood a woman who might be exactly what this town needed, or exactly what they'd always been afraid of. Time, Thomas thought, would tell the difference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The crowd outside had grown to nearly 30 people by the time Reverend Clark stepped through the broken doorframe of the old apothecary. His black coat was pristine despite the ash that coated everything else, and his pale eyes swept the interior with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to rooting out sin. "Miss Ashwood," he said, his voice carrying the particular cadence of Sunday sermons, "I believe we need to have a conversation." Evelyn straightened but didn't retreat. Thomas noticed how she positioned herself, not defensively, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced hostile crowds before. "Reverend, how can I help you?" "That's precisely what we're here to discuss," Mayor Ashford interjected. pushing past the minister with the bluster of a man who considered himself important. This remedy you gave the Morrison child. People are talking. Are they? Evelyn's tone remained neutral, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around her eyes. You cured that baby in minutes, said Martha Henley, the baker's wife, her voice thick with suspicion. Doc Peterson's been treating that child for weeks with no results. How do you explain that? Experience, Evelyn replied simply. And the right herbs. What kind of herbs? This from Dr. Peterson himself, who'd arrived with his medical bag and a face full of wounded pride. I examined that mixture myself this morning. There were compounds I couldn't identify. Thomas watched Evelyn's hands, noting how her fingers had gone still among the pottery shards. Ancient remedies, she said. Passed down through my family. Nothing harmful. Ancient, Reverend Clark repeated, investing the word with ominous weight. And from where, exactly, did your family acquire these ancient remedies? The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas could feel the crowd's energy shifting, curiosity hardening into something darker. He'd seen this before, the way fear could transform ordinary neighbors into something resembling a pack. My grandmother was a midwife, Evelyn said carefully. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers. Knowledge of healing plants goes back generations in many families. Generations of what, exactly? Pressed Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd appointed herself the town's moral guardian since her husband's death. What manner of women were they, these grandmothers of yours? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to settle over the ruined shop like morning mist. They were women who helped when help was needed, who eased pain when they could, who brought children safely into the world and helped the dying leave it with dignity. Midwifery is God's work, Reverend Clark acknowledged. But there are other practices, older practices, that claim to heal but serve a different master entirely. Are you accusing me of something specific, Reverend? The minister's pale eyes never wavered. I'm asking you to explain how a stranger, with no medical training, could succeed where our town's licensed physician could not. I'm asking you to account for the unusual circumstances surrounding your arrival here. Thomas felt compelled to intervene. She helped a sick baby. Isn't that what matters? Stay out of this, Mitchell, Mayor Ashford snapped. This doesn't concern you, doesn't it? Thomas stepped closer to Evelyn, not quite standing between her and the crowd, but making his position clear. Someone helped one of our families. Someone with knowledge we could use. Seems to me that's exactly the kind of person Willowbrook needs right now. What we need, said James Wright, the blacksmith, is to rebuild what the fire took, not to invite more unusual occurrences. You think she caused the fire? Thomas asked incredulously. The silence that followed was answer enough. Evelyn laughed a sound like water over stones, musical but with sharp edges. You think I burned your town? To what purpose? Maybe to make yourself seem useful afterward, suggested Martha Henley. Create the problem, then present the solution. It's an old trick. If I wanted to seem useful, Evelyn said, her voice still carrying that dangerous musical quality, I could have chosen easier methods, less destructive ones, such as, Reverend Clark inquired. Evelyn's smile was enigmatic. I could have predicted the fire. The words fell into the crowd like stones, into still water, creating ripples of unease. Thomas saw people exchange glances, cross themselves, step unconsciously away from the woman who just suggested she might possess prophetic abilities. Predicted it? Dr. Peterson's voice cracked slightly. How? The signs were there, Evelyn sighed, moving to the window and gesturing toward the rebuilt sections of town. Dry summer, old buildings with timber frames and shake roofs, overloaded fireplaces as autumn turned cold. A town with no proper fire brigade and water barrels half empty because the well's been running low since August. Thomas blinked, realizing she was right. All of those things had been problems before the fire problems people had talked about, but never quite gotten around to addressing. Anyone with eyes could have seen it coming, Evelyn continued. Just like anyone with eyes can. See what's coming next if you don't address the real issues. What do you mean? Mayor Ashford demanded. Evelyn pointed toward the eastern end of town, where several families had erected temporary shelters after losing their homes. Winter's coming. Those canvas tents won't keep out the cold, and you don't have enough proper housing for everyone. The Hendricks family is crowded into a space meant for half their number, and little Tommy Hendricks has been coughing for a week. Mrs. Henderson gasped. How do you know about Tommy? Because I have ears, Evelyn replied. And because I've seen what happens when too many people share too little space as the weather turns. That cough will spread, and it won't stop with the children. Dr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. I've been monitoring the situation. Have you? Evelyn's storm-gray eyes fixed on him. When did you last check on the Hendricks boy? Yesterday? 3 days ago? When did you last examine the water quality from the temporary wells dug after the fire? Have you tested the air quality in those makeshift shelters? The physician's silence was telling. I thought not, Evelyn said gently. You're a good doctor, Dr. Peterson, but you're one man trying to care for 300 people who've just suffered a major disaster. You can't be everywhere at once, and you can? Reverend Clark's tone had grown colder. I can be where I'm needed most, Evelyn replied. Starting with the Hendricks family, if you'll allow it. What kind of treatment are you proposing? Dr. Peterson asked, his professional curiosity apparently overriding his suspicion. Nothing dramatic. Elderberry syrup for the cough. Willow bark tea for the fever that's starting. Steam treatments with eucalyptus to clear the congestion before it settles in his chest. Those are actually sound remedies, the doctor admitted reluctantly. Of course they are, Evelyn said. I'm not a charlatan, Dr. Peterson. I'm someone with extensive knowledge of plant-based medicine. Knowledge this town could benefit from, especially during recovery. Mayor Ashford frowned. What exactly are you proposing? A partnership, Evelyn said simply. I help where I can. I share my knowledge with Dr. Peterson so he can verify everything I do. I work openly, not in secret. And in return? In return? Thomas prompted when she hesitated. In return, you give me the chance to prove that I'm here to help, not harm. You let me show you what I can contribute to this community. The crowd exchanged uncertain glances. Thomas could see the appeal of her offer, extra medical knowledge when they desperately needed it, warring with their ingrained suspicion of anything unfamiliar. There would need to be conditions, Reverend Clark said slowly. Oversight, accountability. I accept that, Evelyn nodded. I'll work with Dr. Peterson. I'll explain every remedy I prepare. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Complete transparency. And if there are concerns about your methods? Then you stop me, she said simply. This is your town. I'm asking for the chance to earn my place in it, not to take anything by force. Thomas watched the faces around him, seeing calculation replace pure hostility. These were practical people, and they'd just been offered practical help during a difficult time. The question was whether their fear would override their pragmatism. I'll need to pray on this, Reverend Clark said finally. Of course, Evelyn agreed. And I'll need to examine any treatments before they're administered, Dr. Peterson added. Naturally. Mayor Ashford looked around at the crowd, taking the temperature of public opinion. We'll convene a town meeting tomorrow evening. Let everyone have their say. That seems fair, Evelyn said. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas lingered behind. When they were alone again, he turned to Evelyn with questions burning in his throat. You knew about the Hendricks boy, he said. How? I told you I have ears. You knew exactly what was wrong with him. His symptoms, the progression of his illness. That's not something you learn by listening to gossip. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her hands returning to their careful sorting of the debris. Some things are easier to see when you know what to look for. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now. Thomas studied her profile, noting the way the afternoon light caught the copper threads in her dark hair. Are you what they think you are? What do you think they think I am? Something dangerous. Something unnatural. Evelyn's hands stilled. And what do you think? Thomas considered the question seriously. I think you're someone with unusual knowledge who's been forced to be careful about how you use it. I think you've seen what happens when people fear what they don't understand. And I think you're tired of running from it. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Thomas saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief at being seen clearly by someone who wasn't afraid. The town meeting tomorrow, she said quietly. It won't go well for me. You don't know that, don't I? She gestured toward the street where the crowd had gathered. They're already afraid. And fear makes people do terrible things to protect themselves from imagined threats. Then why stay? Why not move on like you have before? Evelyn was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I'm tired of moving on. Because this place needs help, and I have help to give. And because... She hesitated, then met his eyes directly. Because for the first time in a very long time someone looked at what I could do and saw healing instead of harm. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition, a connection, a sense of rightness that he couldn't quite name. Then we'll face the meeting together, he said. Whatever comes. Evelyn's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Thomas Mitchell, she said softly, you really are either very brave or very foolish. Both, he confirmed. But I'm also right about this, about you. And tomorrow night, I'll make sure everyone else sees it too. As the sun set over the ash-covered ruins of Willowbrook's merchant district, neither of them could have imagined what the morning would bring, or how quickly their fragile alliance would be tested by forces that had nothing to do with town meetings or community votes, and everything to do with the kind of emergencies that reveal who people truly are, when everything they think they know gets stripped away. The screaming started at dawn. Thomas jolted awake in his small cabin on the outskirts of town, the sound cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. It wasn't the cry of an injured animal or the wail of a baby. This was something else entirely. Raw, desperate, human agony that seemed to claw at the very air. He dressed quickly, grabbing his tool belt out of habit, and rushed toward the source of the commotion. Other doors were opening along the street, neighbors emerging with worried faces and hastily thrown-on clothes. The screaming came again, and Thomas's blood chilled as he realized it was coming from the Hendricks' temporary shelter. A crowd had already gathered by the time he arrived. Through gaps between the onlookers, Thomas could see canvas walls bulging and shaking as something thrashed inside the makeshift tent. The screaming had dissolved into incoherent babbling punctuated by periods of ominous silence. "Where's Dr. Peterson?" Someone called out. "Already inside," Martha Henley replied, wringing her hands. "Been in there 10 minutes. Can't seem to do anything." Thomas pushed through the crowd until he reached the tent's entrance. Inside, chaos reigned. Mary Hendricks knelt beside a small cot where her 8-year-old son Tommy writhed in fevered delirium. The boy's face was flushed scarlet, his breathing rapid and shallow. Dr. Peterson bent over him with his stethoscope, but his movements seemed uncertain, almost panicked. "Temperature's climbing too fast," the doctor muttered to no one in particular. "Higher than it should go. This isn't natural progression." "What do you mean, not natural?" Mary Hendricks demanded, her voice cracking with terror. "What's wrong with my boy?" Before Dr. Peterson could answer, Tommy's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and his limbs began to jerk in violent spasms. Foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. "He's seizing," Dr. Peterson said, reaching for his medical bag. "You need to move aside." The voice came from behind Thomas. He turned to see Evelyn Ashwood pushing through the crowd, her leather satchel in one hand and an expression of grim determination on her face. She moved with purpose, no hesitation or uncertainty in her stride. "Miss Ashwood," Dr. Peterson straightened, his face flushing. "I'm handling this situation. Are you?" Evelyn's eyes flicked to the seizing child, then back to the doctor. "Because, from where I stand, that boy is dying while you decide what textbook remedy to try next." "How dare you, Mary?" Evelyn interrupted, kneeling beside the distraught mother. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your son has brain fever, what some call encephalitis. The infection has moved beyond his lungs and into his head. Dr. Peterson's medicines won't reach it in time." Mary Hendricks looked between the two medical practitioners, tears streaming down her face. "Can you help him?" "I can try," Evelyn said simply. "But I'll need to work quickly, and I'll need you to trust me completely." "This is unconscionable," Dr. Peterson sputtered. "You can't just—" Tommy's seizure intensified, his small body arching off the cot with supernatural strength. The sound he made wasn't human, more like the cry of a wild animal caught in a trap. "He's going to die," Evelyn said flatly, not taking her eyes off the boy. "Right here, right now, while we debate credentials and proper procedures. Is that what you want, Dr. Peterson? To be right, or to save a child's life?" The doctor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Mary," Evelyn said again, her voice gentle but urgent. "Do I have your permission?" The mother nodded frantically. "Yes, God, yes. Do whatever you have to do." Evelyn's hands moved with practiced efficiency. From her satchel, she withdrew several small vials and a handful of what looked like dried leaves. "Thomas, I need you to hold his shoulders. Gently but firmly. Don't let him hurt himself." Thomas positioned himself as directed, feeling the frightening heat radiating from Tommy's small body. The boy's skin was burning up, fever bright and dry as parchment. "Dr. Peterson," Evelyn continued, not looking up from her preparations, "I need you to monitor his pulse and breathing. Tell me immediately if either stops." Despite his obvious reluctance, the physician moved to comply. Professional instinct, perhaps, overriding personal pride. Evelyn worked with swift precision, crushing leaves between her palms and mixing them with liquid from one of her vials. The mixture gave off a sharp medicinal smell that seemed to cut through the stifling air of the tent. "What is that?" Dr. Peterson asked, unable to hide his curiosity. "Willow bark, feverfew, and valerian root for the seizure," Evelyn replied, lifting Tommy's head gently. "Mixed with something my grandmother taught me, an extraction from a fungus that grows on certain trees after lightning strikes." That's not in any medical text I know." "No," Evelyn agreed, carefully dripping the mixture between Tommy's lips. "It wouldn't be." The boy's seizure began to subside almost immediately. His rigid muscles relaxed and his breathing grew deeper and more regular. The terrifying heat radiating from his skin seemed to diminish slightly. "How?" Dr. Peterson whispered. "The fungus contains compounds that can cross into the brain tissue," Evelyn explained, continuing her ministrations. "It reduces inflammation and stops the electrical storm that causes seizures. But timing is everything. Wait too long, and the damage becomes irreversible." She produced another vial, this one containing what looked like ordinary water. "This needs to be given every hour for the next 6 hours," she told Mary. "Just a few drops on his tongue. It will keep the fever from spiking again while his body fights off the infection." "Will he be all right?" Mary asked, hardly daring to hope. "The worst is over," Evelyn assured her. "He'll sleep deeply for the next day or two, and when he wakes up, he'll be weak but recovering. Keep giving him fluids, water, broth, weak tea. No solid food until he asks for it. Tommy's breathing had indeed grown steady and peaceful. The flush was fading from his cheeks, and his body lay still and relaxed on the cot. It was like watching a miracle unfold in real time. "I don't understand," Dr. Peterson said quietly. "That progression was too fast. The recovery too complete. What you just did. It's not possible with conventional medicine." Evelyn packed her remaining supplies back into her satchel. Medicine is about understanding how the body works and what it needs to heal itself. Sometimes the answers aren't in textbooks. "Where did you learn this?" "From women who learned it from other women," Evelyn replied. "Knowledge passed down through generations of healers who couldn't afford to let children die while waiting for formal training." Outside the tent, Thomas could hear the crowd growing restless. Word of what had happened inside was spreading, and he could sense the mixture of awe and fear that always followed displays of unusual ability. "They're going to want explanations," he warned Evelyn quietly. "I know. They're going to be afraid." "They should be," Evelyn said, surprising him. "What I just did, it's not something everyone can learn. It requires understanding that goes beyond what most people are comfortable with." Dr. Peterson looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Evelyn hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I mean that some plants only reveal their healing properties to those who know how to ask properly. I mean that timing matters in ways your medical training doesn't account for. And I mean that what just saved this boy's life would be called witchcraft by people who prefer their miracles to come with official explanations." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. "Are you saying you're a ... Dr. Peterson couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm saying I'm someone with knowledge that has been passed down through generations of women who were called many things. By many people, some of those names were complimentary. Many were not." Mary Hendricks looked up from her son's peaceful face. "I don't care what anyone calls you," she said fiercely. "You saved my boy's life." "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "I did." The tent flap opened, and Reverend Clark stepped inside, his pale eyes taking in the scene with sharp assessment. "I heard there was an emergency." "There was," Thomas said before anyone else could speak. "Tommy had brain fever. Miss Ashwood was able to help him when Dr. Peterson's treatments weren't working fast enough." The minister's gaze fixed on Evelyn. "And how, exactly, were you able to accomplish what our trained physician could not?" "Experience with similar cases," Evelyn replied evenly. "And access to remedies that aren't commonly known. Remedies obtained." "How?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Thomas felt the atmosphere in the tent shift, becoming charged with tension and unspoken implications. "Through study and practice," Evelyn said carefully. "Study of what exactly?" Before Evelyn could answer, Tommy stirred on his cot. His eyes fluttered open, clear and alert for the first time in days. "Mama?" he said softly. Mary Hendricks burst into tears, gathering her son into her arms. "Oh, Tommy, oh my sweet boy." "I feel better," the child said wonderingly. "The fire in my head is gone." Thomas watched Reverend Clark's face as he witnessed this reunion. The minister's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to see. "Remarkable recovery," the Reverend said slowly. "Miraculous," Dr. Peterson corrected. "What this woman did. I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," Reverend Clark agreed. "Which raises certain questions. Questions that can wait." Thomas interrupted firmly. "Right now, a boy's life has been saved, and that's what matters." But as they left the tent and faced the crowd of townspeople waiting outside, Thomas realized that questions would not, in fact, wait. The faces looking back at them were filled with a mixture of amazement and suspicion, gratitude and fear. Someone called out from the back of the crowd, "Is it true she cured the boy with witchcraft?" Another voice, "How do we know it wasn't her? Curse that made him sick in the first place?" And from Martha Henley, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "What manner of woman carries the kind of knowledge that can raise the dying?" Evelyn stood beside Thomas, straight and unafraid, facing the crowd that would ultimately decide her fate. In the growing morning light, with ash still clinging to the buildings around them, she looked like exactly what she was, someone caught between being a miracle worker and being burned at the stake for it. "The town meeting is tonight," Reverend Clark announced to the assembled crowd. "I suggest we all have much to discuss." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas caught Evelyn's arm gently. "Are you all right?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ask me again after tonight," she said, "when we see whether gratitude or fear wins out." And in the distance, like thunder before a storm, Thomas thought he could hear the first whispers of the word that would either save Evelyn Ashwood or destroy her. Which? The town hall had never held so many people at once. Every pew was packed, with late arrivals crowding along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. The air was thick with tension and the mingled sense of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and fear-induced sweat. Oil lamps flickered from their wall mounts, casting dancing shadows that made every face look haunted. Thomas sat in the third row, saving a seat beside him that remained conspicuously empty. Evelyn had insisted on arriving alone, refusing his offer to escort her. "If I'm to be judge," she'd told him that afternoon, "let it be on my own merits, not as your charity case." Mayor Ashford called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, though the crowd's murmuring continued, like the buzz of agitated bees. "We're here tonight to address the matter of Miss Evelyn Ashwood and her activities within our community." "Activities," scoffed James Wright from the back. "That's a gentle way of putting it." "Order," the mayor snapped. "Everyone will have their chance to speak, but we'll do this properly. Reverend Clark, you wish to begin?" The minister rose from the front pew, his black coat making him look like a judge of souls. "Thank you, Mayor. Friends, we gather tonight to discuss something that challenges the very foundation of our Christian community. I've spent the day in prayer and contemplation, seeking guidance on matters that frankly disturb me deeply." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. "We've all heard about young Tommy Hendricks," Reverend Clark continued. "A boy at death's door, saved by methods that our trained physician admits he cannot explain or replicate." "Dr. Peterson?" The doctor stood reluctantly. "It's true that Miss Ashwood achieved results that conventional medicine couldn't match. The boy's recovery was unprecedented." "Unprecedented," the Reverend repeated. "Indeed, and accomplished how? With herbs that grow where lightning strikes? With timing that cannot be taught? With knowledge passed down through generations of, what did she call them? Women who were called many things by many people." The crowd stirred, sensing where this was leading. "I've researched these methods," Reverend Clark continued, producing a leather-bound book. "Ancient practices that predate Christian healing. Rituals that invoke powers beyond human understanding. Tell me, friends, what do we call a woman who wields such abilities?" "A healer," came a voice from the middle of the room. Thomas turned to see Mary Hendricks standing, her husband's steadying hand on her shoulder. "We call her a healer who saved my son's life." "Mrs. Hendricks," the Reverend said gently, "your gratitude is understandable, but no." Mary's voice grew stronger. "You weren't there. You didn't see Tommy burning up with fever, his little body shaking like he was possessed. You didn't watch him almost die while we stood helpless. She came when we needed her, and she had answers when no one else did." "And how," asked a new voice, "do we know she didn't cause the sickness in the first place?" Thomas whipped around to identify the speaker, Cornelius Webb, the town's self-appointed moral authority and notorious gossip. "Think about it," Webb continued, standing to address the room. "Strange woman arrives right after our town burns. First the Morrison baby gets sick, then recovers miraculously. Then Tommy Hendricks falls ill with something the doctor's never seen before, and she just happens to have the cure. Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the crowd. That's preposterous, Dr. Peterson objected. Tommy's illness followed a clear progression from respiratory infection to encephalitis. It's a known complication of known to whom, Webb interrupted. You said yourself you'd never seen anything like it. But she knew exactly what it was. And exactly how to cure it. Awful convenient, wouldn't you say? Convenient that she helped a dying child? Thomas couldn't keep quiet any longer. What's wrong with you people? Nothing's wrong with us, Martha Hemley called out. We're being cautious, smart. This woman shows up with abilities no Christian should possess. And suddenly children are falling sick with mysterious illnesses only she can cure. If it walks like a duck, if it walks like mercy and sounds like healing, Thomas shot back, maybe we should be grateful instead of suspicious. Grateful to the devil's servant? This from old Mrs. Henderson, her voice quavering with righteous indignation. I've seen this before, boy. 40 years ago, in the town where I grew up, woman came through with special knowledge, special cures. Made herself indispensable, she did. Until people started dying in ways that made no natural sense. The hall fell silent except for the hiss and crackle of the oil lamps. What happened to her? Someone asked. Mrs. Henderson's eyes glittered in the lamplight. What had to happen? What always happens when the devil sends his agents among God-fearing people. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice, the old woman replied. About protecting our community from influences that have no business among decent folk. Where is she? Mayor Ashford asked suddenly, looking around the packed hall. Where's Miss Ashwood? She should be here to defend herself. Present. The voice came from the back of the hall, near the entrance. Heads turned, necks craned, and the crowd parted like water as Evelyn Ashwood walked down the center aisle. She moved with unhurried grace, her dark hair braided simply, her brown dress neat and unremarkable. But something in the air seemed to shift as she passed, as if her presence carried weight beyond the physical. She reached the front of the hall and turned to face the assembly. In the flickering lamplight, her gray-green eyes seemed to hold depths that made people want to look away. You summoned me, she said simply. I'm here. Reverend Clark stepped forward. Miss Ashwood, thank you for joining us. We have questions. I assumed you did. Are you a witch? The question fell like a stone into still water. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of breathing disturbed the air. Evelyn looked at the minister for a long moment, then let her gaze travel across the faces of the townspeople. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the hall. That depends, she said, on what you mean by the word. You know perfectly well what I mean. Do I? Evelyn's tone remained conversational. Do you mean someone who practices folk medicine passed down through generations? Do you mean someone who understands that plants contain healing compounds your medical books haven't identified? Do you mean someone who knows how to read the signs of illness before they become obvious to others? I mean someone who traffics with dark powers, Reverend Clark said firmly. Someone who makes pacts with forces opposed to God. Then no. Evelyn replied, I am not that. But you admit to practicing unconventional methods? I admit to knowing things that aren't taught in schools or seminaries. I admit to learning from women whose knowledge came from observation and necessity rather than formal training. I admit to understanding that healing sometimes requires approaches that seem mysterious to those who haven't studied them. Dr. Peterson leaned forward. These compounds you use, the fungus extract, for instance. Where exactly do you obtain them? Evelyn turned to him. I gather them myself, from places where conditions are right for their formation. It requires knowing what to look for and when to look. And you learned this from your grandmother? From my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers. Knowledge preserved and passed down through generations of women who had no other way to help their communities. Women who were called witches, Cornelius Webb interjected. Women who were called many things, Evelyn agreed. Wise women. Cunning. Women, herb wives, healers, and yes, sometimes witches. Usually by people who preferred to fear what they didn't understand rather than learn from it. The crowd stirred uneasily. But the question, Reverend Clark pressed, is whether you invoke supernatural aid in your work. Whether you call upon powers beyond the natural world. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas could see her weighing her words carefully. I call upon knowledge, Reverend. I call upon understanding of how living things work and what they need to heal. If you consider that supernatural, I consider unexplainable results achieved through unexplainable methods to be inherently suspect, the minister replied. Especially when they come from someone who admits to following traditions that predate Christian teaching. Christian teaching, Evelyn said quietly, tells us to heal the sick and comfort the suffering. If my methods achieve those ends, shouldn't that matter more than their origin? Not if those methods come from unholy sources. And how, Evelyn asked, do we determine whether a source is holy or unholy? By its fruits? Tommy Hendricks is alive and healthy. The Morrison baby sleeps peacefully. Are those unholy fruits? The devil can work miracles too, Mrs. Henderson called out. Scripture tells us that. Scripture also tells us that by their fruits ye shall know them, Mary Hendricks countered, standing again. What are the fruits of this woman's work? Healing, comfort, life preserved where it might have been lost. If that's the devil's work, then I say we need more devils in this town. Mary, her husband hissed, trying to pull her down. No, Daniel. I won't be quiet. My son was dying, and she saved him. I don't care what anyone calls her. She has my gratitude and my protection. And mine, said a new voice. Jenny Morrison stood near the middle of the hall. My baby suffered for weeks until Miss Ashwood provided relief. Judge her by her actions, not by your fears. Fear keeps us alive, Cornelius Webb shouted. Fear of the unknown, the unnatural, the unholy. Our ancestors knew to be afraid of women like her. Our ancestors, Thomas said, rising to his feet, burned innocent people because they were afraid of knowledge they didn't possess. They chose fear over understanding, superstition over evidence. Is that what we want to be? The hall erupted. In competing voices, some supporting Thomas's position, others calling for caution, still others demanding action against what they saw as a clear threat to their community's safety. Mayor Ashford banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Quiet, quiet, all of you. When the noise finally subsided, he turned to Evelyn. Miss Ashwood, this community has a right to know who and what you are. Will you submit to examination of your methods? Will you allow oversight of your practices? I've already agreed to work openly with Dr. Peterson, Evelyn replied. I've offered complete transparency in my methods. What more would you have me do? Prove that your abilities come from natural sources, Reverend Clark demanded. Demonstrate that you require no external assistance in your work. Evelyn looked at him steadily. And how would you have me prove a negative, Reverend? How does one prove the absence of supernatural influence? Perhaps, said a quiet voice from the back of the hall, the question isn't whether she's a witch. Perhaps the question is whether we can afford to lose someone with her abilities. All heads turned toward the speaker, an elderly man, Thomas. Recognized as Samuel Cross, the town's former mayor and most respected elder. Cross made his way slowly to the front of the hall, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. I've lived in this community for 73 years, he said, his voice carrying despite its frailness. I've seen good times and bad times, plenty and hardship, hope and despair. And I've learned that when someone offers help in times of need, wise people don't spend too much time questioning the gift. He paused, letting his words sink in. We lost half our town to fire 3 weeks ago. Winter's coming, and we have families living in tents. Our doctor is overwhelmed, and our resources are stretched thin. Along comes a woman with knowledge that might help us through the hardest months ahead, and what do? We hold a trial to determine whether she's sufficiently holy to deserve our trust. The hall was silent, everyone hanging on the old man's words. Maybe she's a witch, Samuel Cross continued. Maybe she's just a woman with unusual knowledge. Maybe the distinction matters less than the fact that children are alive today, who might not have been without her intervention. I say we judge her by her actions, not by our fears. And if her actions continue to heal and help, then I say we welcome her, whatever she is. He looked directly at Evelyn. Miss Ashwood, if you're willing to stay and help us rebuild our community, to work openly and honestly with our people, then you have my support. And I suspect you'll have the support of anyone else who values substance over superstition. The old man's endorsement seemed to shift the atmosphere in the hall. Thomas could see faces changing, fear giving way to thoughtful consideration. But he could also see other faces, like Reverend Clark's hardening with determination. The battle for Evelyn's place in Willowbrook was far from over, and Thomas realized that tonight's meeting was only the beginning of a struggle that would test everything he thought he knew about his community, his faith, and himself. As the debate continued around him, Thomas caught Evelyn's eye across the crowded hall. She gave him the slightest nod, not gratitude, exactly, but acknowledgement that he'd chosen a side in a war that was just beginning. And outside, beyond the warm glow of the town hall, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The first child collapsed 3 days after the town meeting, while helping her mother hang laundry behind their reconstructed home. 10-year-old Lucy Patterson simply crumpled to the ground without warning, her small body convulsing as foam bubbled from her lips. By evening, 2 more children had fallen ill with identical symptoms. By dawn of the 4th day, 7 children lay near death, and Willowbrook was in the grip of something far worse than fear. It was drowning in panic. Thomas found Evelyn where he'd expected to, kneeling beside the Patterson girl in the makeshift infirmary they'd set up in the church basement. Dr. Peterson worked frantically at the opposite end of the room, his face drawn with exhaustion and defeat. Between them, 7 small bodies fought for life against an enemy none of them could identify. How long have you been here? Thomas asked quietly, noting the dark circles under Evelyn's eyes. Since Lucy fell sick, she replied without looking. Up from the child. 64 hours. You need to rest. I need to understand what's happening to these children. Evelyn's voice carried an edge Thomas had never heard before, not anger. Exactly, but something harder and more dangerous. This isn't random. This isn't natural. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Evelyn stood and led him to a corner where they could speak privately. Look at the symptoms, she said, her voice barely above. A whisper, sudden onset convulsions, respiratory distress, dilated pupils, excessive salivation. And look at which children are affected. Thomas glanced around the infirmary. I don't see a pattern. Don't you? Evelyn's gray-green eyes were sharp as flint. Lucy Patterson, her mother, spoke in my defense at the town meeting. Billy Morrison, his parents, were the first to trust my remedies. The Hendricks twins, their brother was the one I saved from brain fever. Every single child belongs to a family that publicly supported me. The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. You think someone is poisoning them, Evelyn finished. Yes, with something designed to mimic the symptoms of supernatural affliction. Something meant to make people believe I've cursed their children. That's... Thomas struggled to process the magnitude of what she was suggesting. That's monstrous. It's strategic, Evelyn corrected grimly. And it's working. Have you heard what people are saying out there? Thomas had heard. The whispers had started before sunrise and grown louder with each passing hour. The witch has turned against us. She's taking revenge for the town meeting. Our children are paying the price for our mercy. Dr. Peterson, Evelyn called softly. Could you come here for a moment? The physician approached wearily, his medical bag clutched in hands that trembled with fatigue. If you have any ideas, Miss Ashwood, I'm willing to listen. Nothing I've tried has had any effect. What's your assessment of the toxin? She asked. Dr. Peterson blinked in surprise. Toxin? I hadn't considered. You think they've been poisoned? Look at the symptom cluster. Look at the timing. Look at which families are affected. This isn't disease, it's deliberate poisoning designed to look like supernatural retribution. The doctor's face went pale as the pieces fell into place. My God, you're right. The pupils, the convulsions, the respiratory depression, it's consistent. With alkaloid poisoning. Something from the nightshade family, most likely. Can you treat it? Thomas asked urgently. If I know what specific compound we're dealing with, Dr. Peterson said. But there are dozens of possibilities, and the wrong antidote could make things worse. Evelyn knelt beside Lucy Patterson again, gently lifting the child's eyelid to examine her pupils. Belladonna, she said with certainty, mixed with something else to mask the taste and delay the onset. Probably dissolved in honey or molasses to make it palatable to children. How can you be so certain? Dr. Peterson demanded. Because I know. Plants, doctor. I know their effects, their signatures, their timelines. This is belladonna poisoning, complicated by the addition of foxglove to affect the heart rhythm. If you're right, the physician said slowly, then someone with extensive botanical knowledge is behind this. Someone who understands dosages and interactions. Someone, Evelyn added, who wants these children to suffer and die in a way that will be blamed on witchcraft. The basement door burst open, and Reverend Clark descended the stairs with a group of townspeople behind him. Their faces were grim with purpose, and several carried ropes. There she is, the minister announced, pointing directly at Evelyn, the woman whose curses are killing our children. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Evelyn, but she gently moved him aside. Reverend, she said calmly, perfect timing. We've identified what's wrong with these children. We know what's wrong with them. Cornelius Webb snarled from behind. The minister. They've been hexed by a witch who didn't appreciate being questioned. They've been poisoned, Dr. Peterson said firmly, by someone who wants you to think they've been hexed. The crowd's momentum faltered slightly. Poisoned? Mayor Ashford asked, pushing forward. Are you certain? Belladonna and foxglove, Evelyn sighed, mixed with honey or molasses to hide the taste. Fed to children whose families supported me at the town meeting. Someone is using these innocent lives to turn you against me. Convenient explanation, Mrs. Henderson sneered. Blame poison. When your curses start killing instead of healing. Then test it, Evelyn challenged. Bring me samples of anything these children ate or drank in the past week. Let Dr. Peterson examine them. If I'm wrong, I'll submit to whatever punishment you deem fit. And if you're right? Reverend Clark asked. Then someone in this town is murdering children to frame me for witchcraft, Evelyn replied. And that person is standing among us right now, watching innocent lives hang in the balance while you debate my guilt. The silence that followed was broken by a small voice from one of the cots. Mama? Lucy Patterson was awake, her eyes focusing with difficulty on her mother's face. I'm thirsty. Mrs. Patterson rushed to her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face. Lucy, sweetheart, how do you feel? Sick, the child whispered. But not as sick. The lady gave me medicine that tastes like flowers. What lady? Several adults asked simultaneously. Lucy's eyes found Evelyn. Her. She made the bad taste go away. Evelyn pulled a small vial from her satchel. Activated charcoal suspended in Water, she explained to Dr. Peterson. It binds to toxins in the digestive system and prevents further absorption. I've been giving it to all the children in small doses. That's... The doctor paused, calculating. Actually brilliant. If you're right about the poison, that could significantly improve their prognosis. I am right about the poison, Evelyn said firmly. The question is whether anyone here cares more about finding the truth than they do about finding someone to blame. Samuel Cross pushed through the crowd, his cane tapping sharply on the stone floor. Mayor Ashford, I move that we test Miss Ashwood's theory immediately. Search every house where these children might have eaten or drunk something. Find the source. Now wait just a minute, Cornelius Webb protested. You can't just invade people's homes based on the word of a suspected witch. I can and I will, Mayor Ashford said, his voice carrying newfound authority. If someone is poisoning children in my town, I'll turn over every stone to find them. Form search parties. Check every kitchen, every pantry, every place where food is stored. As the townspeople organized themselves for the search, Thomas noticed something that made his blood chill. One person in the basement hadn't spoken during the entire confrontation. One person had remained perfectly silent while accusations flew. And children suffered. Martha Henley stood near the back of the group, her baker's hands folded calmly in front of her, her face showing none of the outrage or fear that marked everyone else. She watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a play. They'd already seen Thomas caught Evelyn's attention and nodded subtly in Martha's direction. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she followed his gaze, and he saw recognition dawn on her face. Mrs. Henley, Evelyn said conversationally. You've been very quiet tonight. The baker's wife looked up with practiced innocence. Just worried about the children, dear, same as everyone else. Of course you are, Evelyn agreed. And as our town's baker, you must be especially concerned about food safety. Have you noticed anything unusual in your supplies lately? Any ingredients that might have been tampered with? Nothing at all, Martha replied smoothly. I keep very close watch on everything that goes into my recipes. I'm sure you do, Evelyn said. Tell me, what sweetener do you use in your children's cookies? The special ones you've been giving out since the town meeting? The basement fell silent except for the labored breathing of the sick children. Martha Henley's composed mask slipped for just an instant, but it was enough. Thomas saw the flash of calculation in her eyes, the moment when she realized she'd been caught. I don't know what you're implying, she said carefully. I'm not implying anything, Evelyn replied. I'm stating it directly. You've been adding belladonna and foxglove to honey cakes, then distributing them to children whose families supported me. You've been murdering innocents to support your witch hunt. That's preposterous, Martha said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Dr. Peterson stepped forward, his exhaustion replaced by growing anger. Mrs. Henley, every one of these children has been to your bakery in the past week. Everyone received your special treats. Lots of children come to my bakery, Martha protested. That doesn't prove anything. Then you won't mind if we search your shop, Mayor Ashford said grimly. Right now. For the first time since the confrontation began, Martha Henley looked genuinely afraid. You can't just... I can, the mayor interrupted. And I will. Cornelius, James, Samuel, come with me. We're paying Mrs. Henley's bakery a visit. As the group prepared to leave, Evelyn called out softly, Mayor, you might want to check her herb garden as well. Belladonna has distinctive berries, and foxglove has very recognizable flowers. Both would be easy to identify if someone had been cultivating them. Martha Henley's face went white as chalk. You poisoned children, Thomas said, his voice thick with disgust. Innocent children, to frame someone for witchcraft. She is a witch, Martha screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. I've seen her talking to ravens. I've watched her gather herbs under the full moon. She's corrupting our town with her dark arts. So you decided to murder children to prove it? Dr. Peterson asked incredulously. I decided to protect our community from evil, Martha replied, her eyes wild with fanatic fervor. Those children were already tainted by their parents' acceptance of her. I was saving them from damnation. The basement erupted in horrified voices, but Thomas heard none of them. He was watching Evelyn, who knelt beside Lucy Patterson with tears streaming silently down her face. They almost died, she whispered. Innocent children almost died because people feared what they didn't understand. Thomas knelt beside her. But they didn't die. You saved them. This time, Evelyn said. But there will always be others like Martha Henley. People who would rather destroy than learn, who choose fear over hope. As Martha Henley was led away in restraints, still screaming about witches and corruption, Thomas realized that Evelyn was right. This victory was temporary, fragile, built on evidence that might not always be available. But as he watched the poisoned children beginning to recover under Evelyn's care, as he saw their parents weeping with relief and gratitude, Thomas also realized something else. Some things were worth fighting for. No matter how many times you had to fight, the war for Evelyn's place in Willowbrook was far from over. But tonight, at least, healing had triumphed over hatred, and truth had proven stronger than fear. Outside, the storm clouds that had been gathering finally broke, and rain began to wash the ash from Willowbrook's wounded streets. 2 weeks had passed since Martha Henley's arrest, and Willowbrook was beginning to heal in ways that went beyond the physical. The poisoned children had recovered completely under Evelyn's careful supervision, and Dr. Peterson had begun formally documenting her remedies for future use. The town's attitude toward their mysterious healer had shifted from suspicion to something approaching reverence, but it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Thomas. Afternoons when he'd find Evelyn in her newly established clinic, teaching young mothers how to prepare herbal teas for colicky babies, or evenings when she'd sit on his porch, watching the sunset paint the rebuilt buildings in shades of gold and amber. On this particular evening, Thomas was working late in his workshop, crafting replacement window frames for the Henderson house, when he heard voices approaching outside. Through the open door, he could see torchlight flickering between the trees, not the angry orange of mob flames, but the steady yellow glow of lanterns carried by people with business to conduct. "Thomas Mitchell," called Mayor Ashford's voice. "We need to speak with you." Thomas set down his plane and stepped outside to find a delegation of townspeople waiting in his yard. Mayor Ashford led the group, flanked by Reverend Clark, Dr. Peterson, and Samuel Cross. Behind them stood several other prominent citizens, their faces serious but not hostile. "Gentlemen," Thomas said cautiously, "what can I do for you?" "It's about Miss Ashwood," the mayor began, "and about you." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "What about us?" "The woman needs protection," Samuel Cross said bluntly. "Legal protection. Social protection. The kind that comes with proper standing in the community." "She has standing," Thomas protested. "After what happened with Martha Henley, people respect her." "Respect," Reverend Clark interjected, "is not the same as security. Miss Ashwood remains an unmarried woman with no family ties, no property, no legal protections under our laws. She exists at the community's pleasure, not as a matter of right." Thomas frowned, unsure where this conversation was heading. "What are you suggesting?" Dr. Peterson stepped forward. "We're suggesting that Miss Ashwood needs a husband, someone who can provide her with legal status, social protection, and the kind of community ties that would make it impossible for future Martha Henleys to threaten her position. And we think," Mayor Ashford added, "that husband should be you." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stared at the assembled men, trying to process what they were proposing. "You want me to marry her? We want you to consider it," Samuel Cross said carefully. "For both your sakes and for the sake of our community." Miss Ashwood's knowledge is invaluable. We can't afford to lose her to the whims of fearful people or legal technicalities." Thomas ran his hands through his hair, his mind reeling. "Have you discussed this with her?" "We thought it best to approach you first," the mayor said. "Determine your feelings on the matter before involving the lady." "My feelings?" Thomas laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You're asking me to enter into a marriage of convenience to protect someone you were ready to run out of town just weeks ago." "We were wrong," Reverend Clark admitted quietly. "Martha Henley showed us how wrong. Miss Ashwood saved those children not once, but twice, first from illness, then from poison. She deserves better than our suspicion. She deserves better than a marriage proposal motivated by politics," Thomas shot back. "Does she?" Dr. Peterson asked. "Or does she deserve safety, security, and the chance to use her gifts without constantly looking over her shoulder?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the torchlight dance across the faces of the men who'd come to his door with this impossible suggestion. "And what makes you think she'd accept such an arrangement?" he asked finally. "Because," said a familiar voice from the darkness beyond the torchlight, "I've been listening to this entire conversation." Evelyn stepped into the circle of light, her expression unreadable in the flickering glow. Thomas felt his heart stop as he realized she'd heard everything: the practical motivations, the political calculations, the complete absence of any mention of love or genuine feeling. "Miss Ashwood," Mayor Ashford said, clearly flustered, "we didn't realize that I make a habit of evening walks that sometimes take me past Mr. Mitchell's workshop." Evelyn's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "I do, most evenings. In fact," Thomas wanted to say something, to explain or apologize or find some way to undo the damage, but words seemed to have abandoned him entirely. "So," Evelyn continued, "you gentlemen believe I need a husband for protection, and you've selected Thomas as the most suitable candidate. We thought," the mayor began. "You thought it would solve several problems at once," Evelyn interrupted. "Smoothly. Give me legal status, give Thomas a useful wife, and give the community peace of mind about its resident witch." Very practical. The word witch hung in the air like a challenge. "Miss Ashwood," Reverend Clark said carefully, "we don't think of you as, don't you?" Evelyn's gray-green eyes found his in the torchlight. "Then what do you think of me as, Reverend? What am I, if not a witch?" The minister struggled visibly with the question. "A healer. A woman with unusual knowledge. Someone with ... gifts that benefit our community. Gifts that you can't explain or understand, but that you're willing to tolerate as long as they're properly contained within the bounds of marriage and male oversight." Thomas winced at the accuracy of her assessment. "That's not," Dr. Peterson started. "That's exactly what this is," Evelyn said firmly. "And before anyone pretends otherwise, let me be clear. I understand the logic. I understand the necessity. And I understand that in your world, an unmarried woman with unconventional abilities will always be vulnerable to people like Martha Henley." She paused, her gaze moving from face to face in the assembled group. "The question is whether Mr. Mitchell understands what he'd be agreeing to." All eyes turned to Thomas. He could feel the weight of their expectation, the pressure of their practical reasoning, the undeniable truth of their concerns about Evelyn's security, but mostly he could feel Evelyn watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. "I understand," Thomas said slowly, "that you're asking me to marry a woman I barely know for reasons that have nothing to do with love or affection." Several of the men shifted uncomfortably. "I understand," he continued, "that you see this as a practical solution to a practical problem. Protection for her, useful skills for me, stability for the community." Evelyn's expression remained carefully neutral. "And I understand," Thomas finished, looking directly at her, "that none of you have asked what either of us actually wants." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas stepped closer to Evelyn. close enough to see the flecks of gold in her storm-colored eyes. "So I'm asking you directly, Evelyn Ashwood. Setting aside what's practical or politically expedient or socially necessary, what do you want?" For the first time since she'd emerged from the darkness, Evelyn's composed mask slipped slightly. "What I want," she said quietly, "may not be possible. Try me." She looked around at the assembled men, then back at Thomas. "I want to be chosen, not acquired. I want to be valued for who I am, not just for what I can do. I want someone who sees my abilities as part of me, not as something that needs to be contained or controlled." "And do you want that someone to be me?" Thomas asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Evelyn was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've watched you, Thomas Mitchell. I've seen how you treat people, with respect, with kindness, without judgment. I've seen how you defended me when you had no reason to accept that you believed it was right. I've seen you choose truth over convenience, and courage over comfort." She paused, then added, "So yes, if I were to marry anyone, I would want it to be you, but not like this. Not as a political arrangement to solve other people's problems." Thomas felt something click into place in his chest, not the mechanical satisfaction of a problem solved, but the deep recognition of something right and true and meant to be. "Then let's do it differently," he said. "What do you mean?" Thomas turned to address the assembled delegation. "Gentlemen, thank you for your concern, but Miss Ashwood and I can handle this matter privately. Good evening." The dismissal was clear and unmistakable. After a moment of confused murmuring, the townspeople began to disperse, leaving Thomas and Evelyn alone in the circle of torchlight outside his workshop. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Evelyn said once they were gone. "Both, probably." Thomas found himself echoing the words he'd spoken to her weeks ago. "But I meant what I said about doing this differently." "How differently?" Thomas took a deep breath, then did something that probably would have horrified the practical men who'd just left his yard. He got down on one knee. "Evelyn Ashwood," he said, looking up at her in the flickering light, "I'm not asking you to marry me because you need protection, or because I need a useful wife, or because the town needs us both properly contained." Eyes widened slightly. "I'm asking you to marry me because in the weeks since you've been here, you've become the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I sleep. Because your laugh makes me feel like I could build houses with my bare hands, and your smile makes me understand why poets write sonnets." Evelyn's breath caught. "I'm asking you to marry me because I love you, not your abilities, not your knowledge, not your usefulness to the community, but you. The woman who sits on my porch watching sunsets. The woman who hums while she works. The woman who cries over sick children and fights for truth even when it's dangerous." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been carving in secret for days. A small wooden ring, simple and elegant, carved from the same oak he used for his finest furniture work. "I made this for you," he said, holding it up. "Not because anyone told me I should, not because it solves problems or provides security, but because I wanted to. Because I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that love in every way I can." Tears were streaming down Evelyn's face now, catching the torchlight like silver threads. "So will you marry me, Evelyn? Not as a political arrangement or a practical solution, but as my choice and yours?" For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the torches and the distant murmur of the wind through the pine trees. Then Evelyn knelt down beside him, bringing her face level with his, her hands reaching up to cup his cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas Mitchell, I'll marry you. Not because I need protection or you need a useful wife, but because I love you too. Because you see me really see me, and you're not afraid." They stayed there for a long moment, kneeling together in the torchlight, holding each other with The careful reverence of people who understood that what they'd found was rare and precious and worth protecting with their lives. When they finally stood, Thomas slipped the wooden ring onto Evelyn's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand, which in every way that mattered, it had been. "So," Evelyn said, admiring the ring, "when shall we tell the town that their practical arrangement has become a love story?" Thomas grinned. "How about tomorrow? Give them something to talk about that doesn't involve poison or witchcraft accusations." "Oh," Evelyn said with a smile that promised mischief, "I think they're going to have plenty to talk about regardless. After all, they'll be able to say they live in a town where a carpenter married a witch, and everyone lived happily ever after. Are you a witch?" Thomas asked, echoing the question that had started so much trouble. Evelyn's smile widened. "Ask me again in 50 years, she said, "when you've had time to decide whether you care about the answer." And as they walked hand in hand toward the rebuilt heart of Willowbrook, Thomas realized he already knew he wouldn't. The morning of Thomas and Evelyn's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with October sunlight streaming through the colored leaves of the maple trees that surrounded Willowbrook's small church. It had been 3 weeks since Thomas's proposal, 3 weeks during which the entire town had thrown itself into wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that bordered on the manic. It wasn't just excitement, Thomas realized as he straightened his best suit jacket for the 4th time. It was relief. Relief that their resident healer would be staying permanently. Relief that the recent troubles had resolved themselves so romantically. And relief that they could celebrate something joyful after months of rebuilding and recovery. "Stop fidgeting," Samuel Cross advised from his seat in the church's tiny vestry. The old man had agreed to serve as Thomas's witness, and he watched the nervous groom with amused tolerance. "You look fine. Better than fine, you look happy." Thomas caught his reflection in the vestry's small mirror and had to admit the old man was right. Despite his nerves, despite the weight of the commitment he was about to make, he looked genuinely, deeply happy. The kind of happiness that came from knowing you were about to marry exactly the right person for exactly the right reasons. "Is she nervous?" Thomas asked for the 3rd time. "How would I know?" Samuel chuckled. "I haven't seen her since yesterday evening. But Mary Hendricks and Jenny Morrison have been with her since dawn, so I suspect she's being well cared for." Through the vestry's small window, Thomas could see wagons and carriages arriving from the surrounding farms and settlements. Word of the wedding had spread far beyond Willowbrook's borders, drawing visitors who were curious about the town that had weathered fire, poison, and witch accusations only to celebrate love triumphant. "Quite a crowd," Samuel observed, following Thomas's gaze. "Too much attention," Thomas muttered. "This should be private." "Personal. Nothing's private when you marry the local witch," Samuel said with deliberate casualness. "People will always be watching, always judging, always having opinions about your life." "You ready for that?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I'm ready for whatever comes with loving her." "Good answer." The church bells began to ring, their bronze voices carrying across the valley to announce that the ceremony was about to begin. Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and followed Samuel out of the vestry into the main body of the church. The sight that greeted him took his breath away. Every pew was packed, with standing room only along the walls and in the back. But it wasn't the size of the crowd that stunned him, it was their faces. Where he'd expected to see curiosity or residual suspicion, he saw genuine warmth and celebration. These people weren't here as spectators to a curiosity. They were here as community members celebrating one of their own. Dr. Peterson sat in the front row, his medical bag at his feet, a precaution that had become habit whenever large groups gathered. Beside him sat the Morrison family, baby Sarah, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The Hendricks clan occupied an entire pew, young Tommy waving enthusiastically when he spotted Thomas. Even more surprising were the faces. Thomas didn't recognize visitors from neighboring communities who'd come to witness the wedding of the woman whose reputation as a healer had already begun to spread beyond Willowbrook's borders. Reverend Clark took his position at the altar, his pale eyes meeting Thomas's with something that might have been approval. The minister had surprised everyone by volunteering to perform the ceremony, despite his initial suspicions about Evelyn's abilities. "Nervous, Thomas?" the Reverend asked quietly as Thomas took his place. "Terrified," Thomas admitted. "Good shows. You understand the importance of what you're doing." The church organ began to play a simple melody that Mrs. Patterson had practiced for weeks. The crowd rose to their feet, turning toward the back of the church with an anticipatory rustle of fabric and creak of floorboards. And then she appeared. Evelyn stood in the church's open doorway, framed by golden October sunlight, and Thomas felt his heart stop entirely. She wore a dress of deep blue silk that brought out the storm cloud color of her eyes, with white lace at the collar and sleeves that had been lovingly crafted by the town's women. Her dark hair was braided with autumn flowers, goldenrod, and late asters that caught the light like captured starshine. But it was her smile that undid him completely. Not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn during her first weeks in Willowbrook. Not the determined mask she'd donned during times of crisis, but a smile of pure, unguarded joy that seemed to light up the entire church. She walked down the aisle alone, her choice, she'd explained, since she had no father to give her away and no desire to be symbolically transferred from one man's ownership to another's. Her steps were steady and sure, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face as she approached the altar where their future waited. When she reached his side, Thomas found his voice enough to whisper, "You're beautiful." "So are you," she whispered back, and he realized she wasn't talking about his appearance. She was talking about the emotion written plainly on his face, the love that he'd stopped trying to hide or contain. Reverend Clark cleared his throat, and the congregation settled into expectant silence. "Friends," the minister began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the packed church, "we gather today to witness the union of Thomas Mitchell and Evelyn Ashwood in the bonds of matrimony. This is a joyous occasion, made more meaningful by the trials this community has recently endured and overcome." He paused, his gaze finding several key faces in the crowd. "We have learned, sometimes through painful experience, that fear of the unknown can lead us to dark places. We have seen how suspicion and prejudice can poison communities and threaten innocent lives. But we have also seen how courage, compassion, and love can overcome even the deepest divisions." Thomas felt Evelyn's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and steady against his palm. Thomas Mitchell and Evelyn Ashwood represent the best of what a community can be, Reverend Clark continued. Two people who chose to see past surface differences to the deeper truths of character and heart. Two people who stood together when it would have been easier to stand apart. Two people who chose love over fear, understanding over ignorance, unity over division. The minister opened his prayer book, but before he could continue with the traditional ceremony, a commotion erupted at the back of the church. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet, and then the church doors burst open to admit a man Thomas didn't recognize, travel-stained, wild-eyed, and clearly bearing urgent news. "Fire!" the stranger gasped, stumbling down the aisle. "Toward the altar. Millbrook's burning. The whole town's going up in flames." The congregation erupted in concerned voices. Millbrook was only 8 miles away, close enough that smoke would soon be visible from Willowbrook's hills. "When did it start?" Mayor Ashford called out, rising from his pew. 2 hours ago, the messenger replied, still fighting for breath. "Started in the grain warehouse and spread faster than anything natural. We've lost half the town already, and the wind's pushing it toward the residential district." Casualties? Dr. Peterson was already reaching for his medical bag. Dozens trapped in burning buildings. "Our doctor's overwhelmed. and we lost our fire brigade when the engine house collapsed. We need help, medical supplies, firefighters, anyone who will come, Thomas said immediately, though his heart sank at the timing. Their wedding, their perfect day, interrupted by disaster. All of us, Mayor Ashford agreed. We'll organize rescue teams, medical supplies, whatever you need. But as the crowd began to mobilize, Evelyn stepped forward. Wait, she said, her voice cutting clearly through the commotion. Before anyone goes anywhere, there's something you need to know. The church fell silent, everyone turning to look at the bride who should have been exchanging vows, but instead looked like she was preparing for battle. This fire, Evelyn said, her gray-green eyes hard as flint, isn't an accident. What do? You mean? The messenger asked. I mean, someone set it deliberately. Someone who knew that a fire in Millbrook would draw help from neighboring communities. Someone who wanted to lure away our able-bodied men and medical supplies. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. Evelyn, how can you possibly know that? Instead of answering directly, she turned to address the messenger. Tell me exactly how the fire started, every detail. The man shifted uncomfortably under her intense gaze. Like I said, it started in the grain warehouse. Spread too fast, too. Be natural. And the wind patterns? Strong from the east, pushing toward. There's no east wind today, Evelyn interrupted flatly. The wind's been coming from the northwest all morning, and there are no weather systems approaching that would change that pattern. The messenger's face went pale. I might have been mistaken about the direction. You weren't mistaken, Evelyn said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. You were lying. The question is why. Thomas looked around the church and realized that several things were wrong. The messenger's clothes were travel-stained, yes, but not with the ash and soot you'd expect from someone fleeing a fire. His hands were clean, his face unmarked by smoke or tears. And his horse, visible through the open church doors, looked fresh and well-rested, not like an animal that had been ridden hard in an emergency. Who sent you? Thomas demanded. The messenger's eyes darted toward the doors, clearly calculating his chances of escape. But Samuel Cross had moved to block the exit, his cane held like a weapon despite his age. I don't know what you're talking about, the man said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then you won't mind if we send a few riders to Millbrook to verify your story, Mayor Ashford said grimly. No, the messenger said quickly, then caught himself. I mean, there's no time. People are dying while you waste time with questions. People are dying, Evelyn agreed, but not in Millbrook. This is a trap designed to draw our defenders away and leave our community vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? Dr. Peterson asked. Before anyone could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed. From outside the church, multiple riders, approaching fast. Through the windows, Thomas could see dust clouds rising from at least a dozen horses. To that, Evelyn said grimly, the church erupted in chaos as people realized they were under attack. Men reached for weapons they'd left at home out of respect for the sacred ceremony. Women gathered children close, their faces tight with fear. The peaceful wedding had become a siege in the space of a heartbeat. Everyone stay calm, Mayor Ashford shouted over the noise. Form defensive positions. Women and children to the back of the church. Men, grab anything that can serve as a weapon. But Thomas was watching Evelyn, who stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, her wedding dress gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Evelyn? He said quietly. Her eyes opened, and what Thomas saw there made his blood chill. Not fear, not panic, but the cold calculation of someone preparing to do battle with forces that most people couldn't even imagine. Thomas, she said softly, I need you to trust me. No matter what you see, no matter what I do, trust that I'm fighting for all of us. Before he could ask what she meant, The church doors exploded inward, and armed men poured through the opening. At their head rode a figure Thomas recognized from wanted posters, Marcus Blackwood, a notorious outlaw who'd been terrorizing frontier communities for months. "Well, well," Blackwood said, his voice carrying easily through the church as his. Men spread out to surround the congregation. "Looks like we interrupted a wedding. How unfortunate." His eyes found Evelyn, and his smile turned predatory. "You must be the famous witch I've been hearing about. The one with the miraculous healing powers. What do you want?" Thomas demanded, stepping protectively in front of Evelyn. "What I want," Blackwood replied, "is to have a little conversation with your bride. You see, I have some associates who've been very badly injured in recent business ventures. Injuries that conventional medicine can't seem to address. But a woman who can cure brain fever and neutralize poison? She might be exactly what I need." Thomas felt Evelyn's hand on his shoulder, felt her move to stand beside him rather than behind him. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing gold teeth. "Then this lovely wedding becomes a funeral, for everyone." The church fell into deadly silence, the weight of the threat settling over the congregation like a burial shroud. Thomas could hear children crying softly, could smell the fierce sweat of people trapped with nowhere to run. But beside him, Evelyn Ashwood stood straight and unafraid, her storm-colored eyes fixed on the outlaw leader with an intensity that made. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity. "Marcus Blackwood," she said quietly, "you have no idea what you're dealing with." "Don't I?" the outlaw replied. "You're a healer. A woman who plays with herbs and thinks she's special. I've dealt with your type before." Evelyn's smile was sharp as winter wind. "No," she said, "you really haven't." And in that moment, with her wedding dress gleaming in the colored light of the stained glass windows and her voice carrying the weight of ancient authority, Thomas realized that his bride was about to show everyone, friend and enemy alike, exactly what kind of woman she truly was. The battle for Willowbrook was about to begin, and it would be fought by a woman in a wedding dress who had finally decided to stop hiding what she really was. What happened next would be talked about in Willowbrook for generations to come. Evelyn Ashwood stepped forward in her wedding dress, her hands spreading wide as if embracing the air itself. The temperature in the church dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and every candle flame suddenly burned twice as bright while casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "Marcus Blackwood," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the stained glass windows vibrate in their frames. "You came here seeking a healer. But healing and harming are two sides of the same knowledge." The outlaw leader's confident sneer faltered as frost began forming on the metal of his weapons. "What kind of trick?" "No trick," Evelyn interrupted. And now there was something in her voice that was older than the church, older than the town, older than any human settlement in these hills. Just truth. The truth that plants can poison as easily as heal. The truth that storms can be called as well as calmed. The truth that some women carry power that goes far beyond herb gathering and midwifery. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming charged with an energy that made every person in the church feel the hair on their arms stand on end. Several of Blackwood's men took unconscious steps backward, their eyes wide with growing fear. Thomas watched in amazement as the woman he'd fallen in love with, the gentle healer, who hummed while mixing remedies, transformed into something magnificent and terrible. This was what she'd been hiding, what she'd kept carefully controlled and contained. This was why generations of her foremothers had been called witches. "You want healing?" Evelyn asked, raising her hands toward the church's vaulted ceiling. "Then let me show you what true healing looks like." She spoke a single word in a language Thomas didn't recognize, and every weapon in the church, guns, knives, even the decorative sword that hung behind the altar suddenly became too hot to hold. Blackwood's men cried out in pain and surprise. As they dropped their weapons, watching them clatter uselessly to the floor. "Impossible," Blackwood snarled, though his bravado was cracking. "You're just a woman." "Just a woman," Evelyn agreed, and her smile was sharp as winter starlight. "Just a woman whose grandmother could call lightning from clear skies. Just a woman whose great-grandmother could speak to the spirits of the forest. Just a woman who has spent her entire life learning to help and heal, but who also learned that sometimes the only way to heal a community is to cut out the infection that threatens it." She gestured toward the church doors, and they slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The heavy wooden bar that secured them slid into place by itself, trapping everyone inside. "Now," Evelyn said conversationally, "shall we discuss your intentions toward my neighbors? Toward the children who were just beginning to recover from the last time someone threatened them? Toward the community that has finally learned to choose trust over fear?" Blackwood's remaining courage crumbled entirely as he realized he was trapped in a sacred space with something far more dangerous than any of his previous victims. "We'll leave," he said quickly. "Right now, no harm done." "Oh, but harm was intended," Evelyn replied. "Harm to innocent people celebrating a moment of joy. Harm to families who've already endured fire and poison and suspicion. Harm to children who should be safe in their community." She stepped closer to the outlaw leader, and with each step, the temperature dropped further. Ice began forming on the church windows, delicate patterns that looked like ferns and flowers in intricate Celtic knots. "The question is," Evelyn continued, "what should be done with people who threaten communities? What should be done with those who prey on the innocent and vulnerable?" Thomas realized she wasn't just talking to Blackwood. She was talking to everyone. In the church, showing them what she was capable of, letting them see the full extent of the power she'd kept hidden. This was her moment of complete revelation, the point where there could be no more pretending she was simply an herbalist with unusual knowledge. "Please," one of Blackwood's men whispered. "We didn't know. We thought you were just ... Just what?" Evelyn asked, turning her storm-colored eyes on him. "Just a woman who could be intimidated? Just a healer who wouldn't fight back? Just someone who would submit to threats against the people she cares about?" The man couldn't answer. "Here's what's going to happen," Evelyn said, addressing all of Blackwood's gang. "You're going to leave Willowbrook. You're going to leave this entire territory. You're going to find new occupations that don't involve threatening innocent people. And you're going to do all of this because the alternative is discovering just how creative a woman, with my particular knowledge, can be when it comes to causing rather than preventing suffering." To emphasize her point, she gestured toward the false messenger who'd tried to trick them. The man suddenly doubled over in agony, clutching his stomach as if every organ in his body had decided to rebel simultaneously. "Stop," he gasped. "Please make it stop." "Certainly," Evelyn said pleasantly, and the man's pain vanished instantly. "I'm a healer after all. But I hope that demonstration clarifies the situation for everyone." Blackwood and his remaining men were backing toward the walls now, desperate to put distance between themselves and the woman in the wedding dress who commanded forces they couldn't understand or fight. "The doors," Blackwood said desperately. "Let us out and we'll go. You'll never see us again. Will I have your word on that?" Evelyn asked. "The word of men who make their living terrorizing communities and threatening children." "Yes, whatever you want." Evelyn considered this for a moment, then looked around the church at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd feared her, accepted her, defended her, and were now seeing the full truth of what she was. "What I want," she said clearly, "is for this community to never again have to choose between fear and hope. What I want is for the children here to grow up in safety. What I want is for everyone in this church to understand that power, real power, exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves." She turned back to Blackwood. "So here's my offer. You and your men will leave immediately. You'll never return to this territory. You'll find honest work and stop preying on innocent people. In return, I won't demonstrate the less pleasant aspects of my abilities. And if we refuse? Evelyn's smile was colder than the ice forming on the windows. Then you'll discover why smart people have been afraid of women like me for thousands of years. The church doors suddenly swung open, though the wooden bar remained in place. Fresh air flowed in, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of freedom. Go, Evelyn said simply. Blackwood and his men didn't need to be told twice. They fled the church like men escaping a burning building, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors as they ran for their horses and their lives. When the last of them had disappeared, Evelyn turned back to face the congregation. The supernatural cold began to fade, the ice on the windows started to melt, and the candle flames returned to their normal height. But the silence in the church was profound. Thomas could see the faces around him: amazement, fear, awe, uncertainty. People trying to process what they'd just witnessed, trying to reconcile the gentle healer they'd come to know with the formidable force they'd just seen unleashed. Well, Reverend Clark said finally, his voice carefully neutral. That was illuminating. Are you afraid of me? Evelyn asked, addressing the entire congregation. Should we be? Mary Hendricks called out from her pew. That depends, Evelyn replied, echoing her words from the town meeting weeks ago. Are you planning to threaten children? To terrorize communities? To choose cruelty over kindness? No, came the response from multiple voices. Then you have nothing to fear from me, Evelyn said simply. I am what I've always been, someone who protects those who need protection and heals those who need healing. The only difference is that now you know the full extent of what I'm capable of. Dr. Peterson stood slowly. The healing abilities we've seen, they're just the beginning, aren't they? They're the part one chooses to use most often, Evelyn confirmed. Because healing builds communities while destruction tears them apart. Because helping people is more satisfying than harming them. Because I'd rather be known for the lives I've saved than the enemies I've defeated. Tommy Hendricks, still young enough to accept wonders without question, raised his hand. Miss Evelyn, does this mean you really are a witch? Evelyn smiled, the same warm, genuine smile Thomas had fallen in love with. Yes, Tommy, I suppose it does. That's so cool, the boy said with enthusiasm. Can you teach me how to make ice flowers on windows? The tension in the church broke like a dam bursting, replaced by surprised laughter and relieved conversations. People began moving toward Evelyn, not to fear or threaten her, but to congratulate her, to thank her, to welcome her fully into their community. So, Thomas said quietly, taking her hand, are we still getting married today? Do you still want to marry a witch? Evelyn asked. I want to marry you, Thomas replied. Whatever that means, whoever you are, however much power you wield. I want to marry the woman who saves children and protects communities and makes ice flowers on church windows when she's defending the people she loves. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, not of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming relief and joy. Then yes, Thomas Mitchell. Let's get married. Reverend Clark cleared his throat. Well then, shall we continue with the ceremony? I believe we were interrupted just before the vows. And so, in a church still carrying the lingering scent of supernatural winter and the echo of power beyond mortal understanding, Thomas Mitchell married Evelyn Ashwood. They spoke their vows before a congregation that had seen miracles and magic, that had witnessed both the gentle healer and the formidable protector she could become. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, when Thomas kissed his bride, as the church bells rang out across the valley, the people of Willowbrook cheered not just for the newlyweds, but for themselves. They had chosen love over fear, acceptance over rejection, trust over suspicion. And they had gained something more precious than safety or healing. They had gained the knowledge that in a world full of uncertainty and danger, they were protected by someone who wielded power beyond imagination, but chose to use it in service of those she loved. As Thomas and Evelyn walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, rice and flower petals showering down around them, Tommy Hendricks called out, "One last question. Miss Evelyn, I mean Mrs. Mitchell, will you really teach me about ice flowers?" Evelyn paused, looked back at the eager young face and smiled. "Tommy, I'll teach you whatever you want to learn. Magic is always better when it's shared with people who understand that real power comes from helping others." And as they stepped out of the church into the golden October afternoon, as the community gathered around them with celebration and acceptance, Thomas realized that his quiet life as a carpenter had become something extraordinary. He'd married a witch and discovered that love really could conquer fear. More importantly, Willowbrook had learned that sometimes the most powerful magic of all was the courage to see past surface differences to the deeper truths of character and heart. The townspeople would indeed talk about this wedding for generations to come, not as the day they witnessed supernatural power, but as the day they chose to embrace it, to welcome it, and to make it part of their community's story. And every winter afterward, when ice formed on the church windows in patterns too beautiful to be natural, people would smile and remember the day their town's witch got married and magic became part of everyday life in Willowbrook. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.